I'm Jennifer Gunn. Thank you very much for coming to this Thursdays at 4, which is a joint production of Northrop and the Institute for Advanced Study. And I just saw Krishia heading out the door. But thank you, Chris, and thank you, Northrop, for being a co-sponsor of this event. And before we get started, I want to make just a couple of announcements. For those of you who might be interested, the IAS Residential Faculty Fellowship applications are due October 23rd at noon. Don't be fooled, midnight or 5 p.m., don't get it, it's noon, and that's really a kindness so that if you have a technical problem, we can help you fix it. You don't have to panic. It'll still be the working day. Okay, I also wanted to talk about next week's Thursday at 4 presentation, which is part of the Provost's series on academic freedom and campus climate, and it's on trigger warnings, a generative dialogue. It will be back downstairs in our usual seminar room, in the Crosby Seminar Room on the second floor on the east side. So feel free to come, bring your colleagues, bring students, and I hope we're going to have a good discussion. It's really a conversation more than a presentation. Also, I want to point out that this event today, it goes along with a performance on Saturday here at Northrop by the Seán Curran Company, and there will be a pre-talk discussion before the show at 6:45. So please come and take advantage of the ability to talk with Betsy Coker and maybe others in the company too, or whoever shows up in the rest of the audience, about the event and to see a fabulous performance. Tickets are available online or from the box offices conveniently located near the exits to the building when you leave today. Okay, I also want to say, I don't know what my next slide is. Oh, okay, so this is today's presentation, which is Performing Arts as Cultural Diplomacy. And the three panelists you see before you are Betsy Coker from the Seán Curran Company, Sonja Kuftinec from Theater Arts and Dance, and Kathleen Collins from political science. So now I'll just tell you a little bit more about them. Sonja Kuftinec is a professor and associate chair in theater arts and dance here at the University of Minnesota, and she's also on the board of Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life, which is a consortium of universities and organizations that are dedicated to advancing the public and civic purposes of the humanities, arts, and design. And she's created and published widely on community-based theater and theater as a technique of conflict transformation in the Balkans and the Middle East, including a book, Theater, Facilitation, and Nation Formation in the Balkans and the Middle East. And her current research focuses on the Oregon Shakespeare Festival under the tenure of artistic director Bill Rauch, the co-founder of Cornerstone Theater. Kathleen Collins, on the far end to your right, is Associate Professor of Political Science here at Minnesota, and she's author of Clan Politics and Regime Transition in Central Asia, and is currently completing her second book, which is titled The Rise of Muslim Politics, Islam and State in Central Asia and the Caucasus. She's been conducting research throughout Central Asia since 1994, having published articles in World Politics, Comparative Politics, the Journal of Democracy, Political Research Quarterly, and and in several edited volumes. And she's also done extensive consulting for the National Bureau of Asian Research, the UN Development Program, USAID, the International Crisis Group, and other policymaking organizations. And Elizabeth Betsy Coker, on this end, trained at the Washington School of Ballet and the Ballet Nacional de Cuba before she joined the Washington Ballet for several seasons. She's been I knew I should have put this on the same piece of paper, a member of the Seán Curran Company since 2006 and its associate artistic director since 2009. She graduated summa cum laude from Columbia University with a degree in psychology and dance and earned her master's in the field of motor learning and control from Teachers College, part of Columbia University, where she is currently a doctoral student researching uses of motor imagery by dancers. She teaches contemporary technique and somatics at the Tisch School of the Arts and has taught and set choreography in university dance departments and dance companies across the country. She's been the assistant choreographer for or appeared with the Le Monde Dance Company, Royal Winnipeg Ballet, Opera Theater of St. Louis, Opera de Montreal, San Diego Opera, and the Yale Repertory Theater, and I bet the list gets even longer. So thank you, all three of you, for coming together for this conversation, and we look forward to discussing it afterwards.
So I'm going to begin by just offering a few framing remarks and introducing some critical questions. And then we're going to hear about 10 to 12 minutes from Betsy about the specific work of the Seán Curran Company in their relationship in Kyrgyzstan as cultural ambassadors of Dance USA. Then Kathleen Collins will talk a little bit more about the political framework of our relationship with Kyrgyzstan. And then there'll be some crosstalk between them, and then we will open it up for all of you. I'll just say a few words about what my interest in this question about what is the role of the artist as cultural ambassador comes in part from the work that I have done in the world, mostly in the Balkans. In the mid-90s, some of you may remember, there was a war going on there, and my family is from that region. And I was in graduate school at the time and just feeling like, what can I do as an artist in response to this space of political violence that feels very close to me and distant from me at the same time? And my father, who's from the country, I remember him sitting me down and saying, I decided at a certain point to travel with a group of artists to a refugee camp in Croatia. And he sat me down and said, do you really think that what a group of refugees needs right now is art? This was, I think, on the way to the airport. I was panicked. Like, oh no, what am I doing? But in that particular situation...
It's an Amber Alert. Because child abduction.
Yeah.
Nancy Duncan. It's all going on. Sorry, we did.
That's all good.
Okay, pay attention to that or not? Okay. In that particular situation, it turned out that it felt for the participants in the project that I ended up doing with a choreographer that the piece of work we did was really important to them because it enabled them at the moment to be something other than refugees, to be something other than defined as political victims, as something outside of a group of people that had agency to make decisions about their life going forward. So theater and dance in that space enabled them to create this kind of visionary imagination that also activated for them the sense that they could still be social subjects. That was a much more grassroots kind of project, and what I'm curious about hearing more about from Betsy and Kathleen is what happens when the work of ambassadorship and acts of translation happen at a state-sponsored level. So what we're going to be in conversation about is that process of cultural exchange and the notion of cultural ambassadorship from the perspective of both the artist and the political scientist. We'll explore notions of exchange via media. There are exchanges that occur in this particular piece around the media of poetry, music, and dance, and Betsy's going to talk about why that happened, which we're all curious to know more about. And then we're going to situate this in terms of a few questions, like has the function of the artist as cultural ambassador, as a state-sponsored cultural ambassador, transformed since the Cold War era, and in particular since the post-9/11 era? What's at stake for the state in supporting cultural ambassadors to Central Asia at this time? And just to put it another way, what's the work of how an artist makes sense of that kind of ambassadorship and exchange, and how is that different from a political scientist? So, I hand it over to you, Betsy. Tell us more about this project.
Am I on?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not used to speaking on stage. I'm used to being silent on stage, but thank you for that. Seán Curran Company was first alerted that we might be going on some sort of State Department affiliated tour in 2011, and it was a little bit quiet and under wraps, and we're a small company, we're a young company, and we said, yeah, we had no questions, which seems to be the response that they wanted. And we were part of the first full year of Dance Motion USA. They had piloted it the year before. I'm happy to say now that it's still going. They're still sending 3 or 4 dance companies from the US, from also importantly not just from New York, from different parts of the US, out to various locations in the world. And Brooklyn Academy of Music is responsible for matching the stylistic content of the kind of work and the thrust of the work artistically with the regions that you get assigned to. Seán Curran started in traditional Irish step dancing and Irish folk art. And I think it was Joe Malillo at BAM who said that this would be a really good fit for Central Asia. They have a very, very strong folk music tradition that is, we learned, related to music traditions of the British Isles and interestingly also Appalachia. So if you come to the show, you might be able to make some of those links orally. But we were assigned to Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. And interestingly for us in this narrative, Kyrgyzstan was last. It was the 5th week of our 5 weeks. Turkmenistan was a wild ride. Kazakhstan seemed more like home, or relatable. And Kyrgyzstan was just, I mean, it was literally a place I had to look up on the map. I had not heard about it in any depth. I didn't know anything about it. We had a little bit of information before we left, but we did most of our learning on the ground when we got there. Dance Motion is a very interesting program in that it is almost entirely based in teaching and person-to-person engagement. In 5 weeks, we did 9 performances, which for a touring company is pretty low. But we were in studios, in schools, in orphanages, in town squares, in embassies, teaching and taking classes every day, which was fascinating. And part of the program that I found particularly interesting and inspiring was that when we left, they had said to us, it would be really great if you found someone to collaborate with. And we were like, we agree. It would be really great. Also, to hear that from this sort of patron makes it sound like maybe they want you to keep working, which as a young dance company in the US is really nice. And so we had our eyes open, and I don't know if it was the framing of this idea of collaboration or our own sort of naivete about it, but we were looking for a dance company. And we really thought that what we would come back with would be a movement collaboration. And the area that we went to, most of the largest part of their dance tradition, their modern dance, not modern dance, their contemporary dance tradition is in Soviet ballet, post-Soviet ballet. And so it was really interesting for us to go somewhere very far away and culturally exotic and new to us, and to see something. I mean, this is how I was trained. I spent 15 years doing Russian ballet, and they're very good at it. They're incredible, and that's exciting. And it wasn't anything new. And so it was a little like, well, you know, if we were meant to collaborate doing traditional ballet, we would have done it already. So we sort of kept persisting, and there actually was also a large presence of Western choreographers in Kazakhstan, and so then we thought we came this far to meet people from the US. Maybe this is not quite right either. And on a total fluke, we ended up being offered a private concert by a school that had an associated professional music ensemble. And the school was, I mean, they're adorable, they're precious, they're cute little kids running around with bowl cuts, and it's just, everything's wonderful. And they sit down and they're technical phenoms, every single one of them. And I think at that moment, you know, we recognized that this was a formidable institution, and we had to hear the professional ensemble that came out of this school. And immediately upon sitting down and hearing them play, Seán turned around and said, this is it. It was this. We had our eyes closed to music all along, and actually this is what it should have been. Interestingly, we later learned, because we were trying to put together what we were thinking of, we should probably learn Kyrgyz folk dance. We should probably try to learn it, and not to recreate it in any way, but understand what is the physical response in this culture to their music, and what characterizes it in a certain way, and how do we understand the music better by knowing that. And we were told multiple times that they just didn't have a strong codified folk dance tradition. And as dancers, it was a little bit frustrating. Like, really, come on, you have to, you must. We really don't. But it also let the door open for us. That we started to go into the studio 2 years ago thinking, well, what if we made up our own? How can we filter our own experience of this place, of this environment, of what we have learned of these people and what we will learn more about from these people by collaborating with them over long distances and make it into its own kind of folk dance. I guess the last note that I would make is that by going to these places and having these sort of cultural ambassadorships specifically filtered through this folk tradition, this idea of folk tradition, we were really impressed by the idea that American modern dance is treated in other places like a folk tradition. It's something that is nascent to our country. Dance historically, that is arguable, but I think in terms of a strong cultural tradition that has been around long enough to start to branch out and find its own pockets within the country, that we really have this as our own. And so we found that common ground with the musicians as well.
Did you want to show that video?
Oh, yes. So Seán isn't able to be here. He's dealing with an illness, but I think it's best, we'll understand best about him and the work if we can see him speak about it. So I have a little shirt.
Sorry. Let me just go back here a little bit. Make sure that
It's a clip that was made by Brooklyn Academy of Music in anticipation of our premiere there. So he's speaking about our experience of being there, the sort of creation of the work.
Sorry. My mute doesn't seem to want to come off.
I'm just going to fill in with what he might be saying, and then we'll get to him whenever we get there. Oh, these are our studios at NYU. So our tour was in April of 2012. We premiered in late September of 2015, and this was actually, from the inside, we experienced it as a very tight timeline. Doesn't seem like it, but other than just logistically getting visas and paperwork and all of this. This was in a dance school in Kyrgyz. Here they are. Actually, a couple of them who were high school seniors when we went are in the ensemble now and here on this tour, which is very exciting. The one on the right. Yeah, so we started actually creating movement material for this piece 2.5 years ago. And that has had, I think, a lot of time to evolve and for us to know the movement well enough to know what, really what it means to us physically, what it means in our bodies, what it projects, and I think is also an important thing. It's not a dance that we went into a studio and just sort of made and then left the studio a month later and put on stage. We really have been learning about it physically for a very long time. And it changes often. Seán is notorious for making changes. Lots and lots and lots of changes. Sad times. You might notice, it sort of depends on what clips made it into this, but so Seán, he was an Irish folk dancer, and then he made his career with Bill T. Jones' Arnesian Dance Company. He was a founding member of Stomp, and rhythm and rhythmic complications and a sort of cognitive understanding of rhythm at higher levels that I'm still achieving is integral to his work. And he was joking around that it appeared a lot of the Central Asian folk dances that we did see outside of Kyrgyzstan were all arm gestures. And he said, well, it's funny because I only just do feet. And you've seen Irish step dancers, it's feet, yeah. And so there's one thing that you, in the piece, if you see it, you will see in the beginning of the first 10 minutes of the piece, we introduce the gestural language that we created. And it's 68 individual gestures that then get repackaged in certain ways, and it's a bit of a mind game. But that was our way of, we called the challenge arms, legs, and how do you switch? How do you recreate the rhythm and the qualitative characteristic of these foot rhythms with the arms? And of course, he couldn't leave well enough alone, and he said, can you do that with the feet in this rhythm with the arms off of it? Yeah, so that's our sort of gestural translation.
Do you want to talk just a little bit
Yeah.
about this poem?
I'm sad. I'm hearing Sean's voice in my head right now. So,
Sorry about the sound.
it's okay. So it's on our Facebook page.
Okay.
Seán Curran Company. The Whitman poem actually came the first day that we went to this concert in Kyrgyzstan. We heard them play, and after they played, Seán approached the director and said, through a translator, said, "I want to work with you and I want to make a dance together." And we had a meeting the next day with Nurlenbek Nishanov, who's the music director of the ensemble, and just to hash out how is this possible, how do we even start a conversation about what you do and what I do and how this might come together. And one of the compositions that was played for us, Seán particularly liked, and he asked Nurlenbek about it. He said, what is that? What does that? Where did that come from? Is it traditional? Is it an arrangement of a traditional text? And Nurlenbek said, no, it's my own arrangement, it's my own composition, it's called Dream. Okay, why? Okay, well, it's from my favorite poem. Okay, what's that? You know? And it's like, oh, it's Walt Whitman. Of course, we were both like, what? We're in Bishkek, how strange. And Nurlenbek had written a suite of songs to very shorter sections from Leaves of Grass, and specifically Calamus. And it was an interesting point of departure for us because it started a conversation not about what the piece would be about. So it wasn't, we didn't want to jump into a water of like, what is the piece going to be about? And what, can you see it and then have a dinner discussion about the linear narrative you saw through the piece? It's something that we were sort of avoiding. That's not really the kind of work that we've tended to make. And I think Nurlenbek was saying, like, well, how do you know what happens in the dance if you don't know who the characters are or how they relate to each other? And we had a sort of difficult time explaining that we make abstract scenes of life. Sort of, we are ourselves on stage. And this poem seemed like a good point of departure to have a basis of some kind of abstract narrative. So it's about a place. The piece is about going to a place. We have a section that we internally call arrival. We have a section that we internally call departure. And that's sort of inescapable, and I hope that that's clear. But other than that, we can create different understandings and experiences of that space, of that environment. And the poem itself, I think, gave us a little bit of grounding, shared grounding, without leading us in any like very, very specific particular narrative direction. City of Friends.
Great. Thank you. Let's see. So, Kathleen's.
Oh, I turned them all off.
So Kathleen's going to take us on a slightly different journey, framing the political and cultural landscape of Kyrgyzstan from her perspective.
Is this on? Hello? Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much to IAS and Northrop for having this event and for inviting me, and certainly for inviting the Seán Curran Company. I think the production will probably be fascinating and wonderful, and as somebody who has a great fondness for Kyrgyzstan, I was extremely excited to hear that a group of Kyrgyz artists were coming to Minnesota, and specifically to the U of M. So I strongly encourage you to attend on Saturday night. What I'm going to try to do briefly is to provide a little bit of historical, political, a little bit of cultural background within which we might think about where this particular, not this particular piece of art per se, but this event of the U.S. State Department sponsoring this type of cultural exchange and cultural diplomacy actually sort of comes into modern-day Kyrgyzstan in its relations with the United States. I'm guessing that most people here don't know a whole lot more than you did, about the historical, political, cultural background of Kyrgyzstan. And in fact, 25 years ago, I didn't know that much myself. But I started going to Kyrgyzstan in 1994 when I was a first-year graduate student. And the then recently appointed Kyrgyz ambassador to the United States, who had recently been appointed as foreign minister of the country, came to my university, and she was looking for free help. So my graduate director, my PhD advisor, suggested that I go there instead of Russia, where I had been planning to go, to work for her for the summer. It ended up turning into a sort of year-long project of working for her in the new foreign ministry of Kyrgyzstan, in what was at the time a completely new state. Recently independent from the Soviet Union in 1991, the end of 1991, and so it was in the process of setting up its own statehood. And I had the great privilege, really, of being there at that time, of working with some fascinating people who were terribly interested in developing relations with the West. And the United States at the time was quite interested in developing relations with the former Soviet republics, and I'll get to some of that politics in a minute. But to us, Kyrgyzstan is this very new country. Hasn't even been on the map for 25 years yet. We're just coming up on the 25-year anniversary. So to us in the U.S., I think to the West more broadly, Kyrgyzstan is one of those countries that people really know very, very little about. As I mentioned, it achieved its independence in late 1991, not by struggle, but by virtue of the Soviet Union's collapse. Kyrgyzstan had been one of the 15 Soviet republics for the previous 70 years or so. Prior to that, it did not exist in its own right as any sort of modern independent state. If you want to flip back to the broader map of the region there, as you can see, it lies in a territory which is largely mountainous, combination of mountain, and the northern parts are quite the steppe region of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Were areas which had been part of the Russian Empire prior to 1917. So roughly from the mid 1860s until 1917, they were part of the Russian colonized region, which had brought to the country this interesting mixture of Russian culture, bringing a lot of Russian settlers, as you mentioned, the Russian ballet being a strong tradition in the country. I think that's where it came from. And that continued throughout the Soviet period. So Kyrgyzstan, in its own right, is not an independent state, and has really only this very, very recent sense of being an independent state and an independent people. Prior to that, going back several hundred years before the Russian colonial period, this was a region that was inhabited largely by nomadic tribes. Despite this, however, we tend to think of it, as this terribly new country with this new history, new politics, new tradition. Despite this, I would actually argue that the Kyrgyz have an incredibly rich history, incredibly rich culture going back for many centuries prior to that of the 20th century or 21st century. And in that sense, the Kyrgyz people, I think, are increasingly attempting to re-identify with that history and that tradition, and much of the artistic work that you're studying and engaging with, I think, is a part of that process. As I mentioned, in the prior to the Russian colonial era and the Soviet period, they were largely a nomadic and tribal people, and they passed on their traditions, both cultural, ethnic, as well as Islamic traditions, because it's largely an Islamic region. They passed it on orally. And they passed it on through a culture which was very rich in storytelling, through music, both through narrative as well as through musical storytelling. Traditional throat singing, as you probably observed, is a very deep and rich part of their culture that's been carried on for centuries and centuries. And that's how they passed on their history. This was a region which did not have a written language until the 20th century, until the Soviet era. It was actually the Soviets who imposed a particular form of written language that distinctly became known as Kyrgyz upon them. So the oral tradition, the musical oral tradition, is an extremely central part of who they are as a people, what their history is, their history of becoming an Islamic people, of adopting Islam, going back to the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries in different parts of the country, is all told through that very rich oral tradition. I've also noticed myself that dance is not a central part of that tradition, and most of the dance that I've observed just as a political scientist visiting Kyrgyzstan over the past 2 decades has been that Russian ballet, but increasingly they're starting to develop, I think, performances of some of their rich oral traditions, like the Manas, the great Manas epic, of their great warrior, hero, and leader, and they're starting to put that to dance in interesting ways. But it is, as you noted, a very new tradition. Music, therefore, I think is very much an expression of their identity as a people. It's an expression of their history. It's an expression of their spirituality that includes both pre-Islamic as well as the strongly Islamic tradition, which differs in very unique ways from what I think we typically perceive in the West as being sort of Arab Islamic tradition. I think the Kyrgyz, as you'll notice, I think on Saturday night, the Kyrgyz Islamic tradition comes out in a much perhaps more pluralist or sort of less stereotypical way than many people are familiar with it. It illustrates, I think, the cultural diversity within Islam itself. I should note that the Kyrgyz people they and their traditions survived the Soviet era, interestingly, despite an enormous amount of repression from the state and an attempt by the state to redefine and shape a particular Soviet culture, a new Soviet man, for the entire 15-republic conglomeration or federation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So they survived that imposition of what was known as socialist realism, which is a terribly uninteresting artistic tradition in the performing arts, as well as in painting and all other forms of music, literature, poetry, and humanities that really dominated over the past 70 years. And what they've been doing for the past 20 years or so is attempting to both nationally as well as from a grassroots level, attempting to revive that national tradition and that national identity. And I think what the type of artistic work that you're engaging with is very much a reflection of that process. Unfortunately, I would note that very, very little of this rich history and tradition and culture is known outside the region. And that's largely due to, I think, the way in which history has probably been very Eurocentric in the way it's been taught in the West. Kyrgyz always shamed me in knowing far more about my history than I knew about their own history when I first started going there as a student in the early 1990s. In fact, they knew far more about American history than I knew myself about my own American history, which was always quite stunning to find out. And what Kyrgyzstan, I think, has been most known for, even amongst those who actually focus on that country in the West today, are for its contemporary politics. And there are sort of 2 key elements of that. One is its sort of struggle for democracy over the past some 20-25 years. And that's involved essentially 3 revolutions. And we're not talking about massive bloody revolutions, but major turnovers in power in which first of all, the Soviet regime collapsed, and then another regime came to power, the Akayev regime, which became extremely corrupt, started to falsify elections. That was overthrown in really quite dramatic civil society protests. Another government came to power, the Bakiyev government, which rapidly descended into very corrupt clan-based authoritarianism again. And most recently, in 2010, we had another sort of people power revolution, backed in large part by Russia, which threw out the Bakiyev regime for interesting reasons. It was too pro-US, actually, and brought the current government to power, which some of you may have noticed there were just elections in Kyrgyzstan just a few weeks ago, parliamentary elections, and a major part of U.S. diplomacy and U.S. political efforts there has been to help organize, facilitate, and encourage democratic elections. And I have to give the Kyrgyz credit because it was one of the cleanest elections, probably the cleanest election has been reported as so far in all of Central Asia's history. So the Kyrgyz are yet again sort of endeavoring in the process of democratization. And U.S. interests over the past 20 years have been very much focused on that issue. A second area of U.S. interest, and the second area in which Kyrgyzstan comes into the news recently, is because of the growth of Islamic fundamentalism. Not so much in Kyrgyzstan per se, but more broadly in the region. But Kyrgyzstan itself has had a phenomenon of increasing numbers of young, unemployed, as well as some quite well-educated Kyrgyz joining ISIS. It's become actually one of the major feeding grounds for ISIS in the region. In Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, increasingly neighboring Kazakhstan as well, have sent probably well over 1,000, several thousand of their citizens to join ISIS. And that's, you may have noticed, has made it to the news quite a number of times over the past 2 years or so. So Kyrgyzstan is sort of known for these two sort of almost polar opposite extremes. On the one hand, they seem to be the country that's most promoting democracy in a region which is really stuck in authoritarianism, quite generally from Russia on down. And on the other hand, it's a country which, in large part because of its internal political, religious, and corruption problems, it's become a major breeding ground for Islamic fundamentalism, and seems to be becoming more so in that respect. Within that context, I think having a broader and deeper understanding of the culture and the history of the society and the country, I think, is really critical for us as Americans, as Westerners, and for those within government who are making government policy towards the region. Rather than focusing so narrowly on elections and Islamic fundamentalism, I think it's important that we as a society and that our policymakers have a deeper and richer appreciation of what that country is actually all about. So turning back to this issue of cultural diplomacy that Sonja started with, I think I'd like to just offer a few remarks as to where I think your project in this artistic endeavor fits into the whole phenomena of cultural diplomacy and U.S.-Kyrgyz relations. The policy, I guess we might call it, of cultural diplomacy dates, I think, at least to the 1960s. The Khrushchev era, Cold War politics that you brought up at the beginning, Sonja. And comes out of the Department of State. The Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, I think, is probably responsible for funding or sponsoring this program, as well as numerous other programs, some of which students might be quite interested in, such as the Fulbright program, to help send cultural ambassadors of many different types, not just artists, but of many different types, to engage with different countries around the world. As students, as teachers, I've been asked a number of times to apply for Fulbright programs to go over and teach in Kyrgyz University or some of the other republics of Central Asia. I'd love to be able to do so at some point, because I think those are other ways in which we can also be cultural ambassadors to the region. The program probably originated, I would guess, in the Cold War era, and a certain ideological agenda, an attempt to open up society, open up our borders, spread our ideas of democracy. To a certain extent, I think that continues, although I think it's probably somewhat more independent and less ideologically driven now. I think it's evolved over time. I was looking at some of the BAM materials about the program in Kyrgyzstan and elsewhere over the past week, and I noted that one of the directors of that program comments on it as being a public-private partnership, and I think that's probably one of the best ways in which this type of cultural diplomacy and ambassadorship can operate, allowing opportunities for American artists to go to Kyrgyzstan and other republics in the region, and facilitating opportunities for those artists as well to come here. It's two-sided, really. I think we tend to think of it as one-sided, as us exporting our culture there, but it's very much a two-sided operation and opportunity for artists from Kyrgyzstan to come here, and for artists in society in Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan to experience American culture and share their culture with us as well. Turkmenistan, I should note, is probably one of the most closed societies in the entire world. I've been trying to do some research there recently, and it's all but impossible to get a research visa to go to the country. It's so incredibly closed. I was actually just talking to somebody with an NGO in Washington today who said, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan are becoming the next North Koreas. They're so incredibly close. So it's fascinating to me that you're able to go there as a dance troupe and engage with society in that way. It gives me hope for the potential for greater collaboration
I should
in the
mention
future.
that they tried to send another group recently back to Turkmenistan and they were refused. So they were more open when we were there than they are now.
Interesting. Yeah. It does not surprise me. I have made it there on 2 occasions, and it was an incredible process to get a visa. And then your every movement within the country is controlled. It actually makes the Soviet Union and the Brezhnev era look pretty good. So, but I'm glad you at least had some progress in getting there, and hopefully some interesting exchange and dialogue took place. Just on the sort of goals and politics of cultural diplomacy, because I think they are there, and I think they're multi-layered. I'll note that U.S. policy in the region has been relatively consistent since Kyrgyzstan became independent. Whether you're listening to a Bush-era official or a Clinton-era official or one from the Obama State Department, it's always the same. It's about democracy, it's about security, and it's about economic openness. And those are the 3 issues that they highlight. Now, which they emphasize has varied somewhat over time. I think the democracy agenda has been, unfortunately, probably the lesser of those 3 agendas. And but nonetheless, that cultural exchange, I think, is importantly included in that sort of pro-democracy agenda. So what does the U.S. State Department hope to get out of this? I think they're hoping to, similar to the Cold War era, they're hoping to get an exchange of ideas, an exchange of society, help open up societal dialogue. I don't think this is as direct in the case of artistic work, but I think they're trying to sort of break down barriers, open exchange, open civil society exchange, civil society networks through a broad range of different types of societal actors. So not nearly defined as exchanges through political parties or very directly political organizations, but much more broadly through different types of actors, whether it be student exchanges, of which there have been many with Kyrgyzstan over the past 2 decades, faculty exchanges, artistic exchanges, and others. So I think that's really an incredibly important part of building that type of relationship. Even during the Soviet era, I would note that these types of academic and scientific exchanges were starting to take place from the Khrushchev era onwards, and some of them were actually quite successful. For example, in building a coalition of scientists, both in the United States and in the Soviet Union, who were lobbying their own governments against nuclear war. So some of these exchanges can really be incredibly important. Another area that I would highlight is that these exchanges help bring mutual respect and a breakdown of stereotypes which exist both within Central Asian society and within the West about each other. Some of you have probably seen Pew data on views about Americans abroad and views of Americans about particularly the Muslim world. So I think having the possibility for those one-on-one, very grassroots type of societal exchanges really helps to break down many of those types of, stereotypes that exist. For an American going to Kyrgyzstan like I was when I was 21, it was really fascinating. I wasn't quite sure what to expect. A bunch of Islamic radicals or a bunch of hardcore communists. At the time, Kyrgyz history, Central Asian history wasn't taught anywhere in the United States. So for me, having that sort of personal experience and exchange was incredibly important. And I've noticed that amongst both Kyrgyz students who've come to study in the United States as well as Americans who have gone there through various programs. My own work on religious revival over the past 10 years or so, both Islamic as well as Christian revival, has highlighted to me just how much those stereotypes still exist, and unfortunately in the post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan world, after the U.S. sent troops to those countries, in the Muslim world, including Kyrgyzstan, which is really sort of at the edges or sort of far reaches of what's been, so the traditional hotspots in the Muslim world, nonetheless, there's been a growing perception that the United States has a negative agenda in the region, has an anti-Islamic agenda in the region, doesn't appreciate Muslims, doesn't appreciate Islamic culture. So I see even sort of small endeavors like this as a way of helping to break down some of those stereotypes. And I think I'm kind of close to running out of time, so I'll just wrap up by saying that on the one hand we can sort of see these types of cultural diplomacy exchanges as being, cynically I think we could see as being sort of part of U.S. policy, a U.S. attempt to put a particular ideological spin on art, whether it be here or in other parts of the world. But I think that there are these positive aspects that are very likely to develop out of these relationships as well. And I've really been pleased to see those relationships develop in Kyrgyzstan over the past 20 years or so. So I have to say I'm a great supporter of this type of endeavor. And for Kyrgyzstan, just as for us, I think is incredibly important to them, again, in the context of being a new country that's attempting to revive its national identity and history after 70 years of communism. I think it's incredibly important to them to be able to showcase their rich history, their music, their culture, their identity in this way. So I think what we're doing has both positive consequences for them as well as for us.
Thank you so much. So let's just take a few minutes, I think, to have a conversation between the two of you and before we open it up. And one of the things that we were talking about before we came up here, Betsy, is about how this ambassadorship was framed for you as a group of dancers, and the way that the State Department prepped you about how and what to say and how and what not to say. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that and how
sure.
Kathleen's framing maybe informs some of what you understand your role to have been after the fact.
Definitely. So I would mention that we were speaking a little bit about sort of Cold War ambassadorship in the 60s, and as dancers in New York and in the US, we were very aware ourselves as dancers in the company that these were programs that used to be available to dancers in the 60s and 70s and had not been available for a long time. Finding work as a dancer is very hard, and any opportunity you get seems like a good idea to take. And hearing that these programs might be renewed again was really exciting. And so, I mean, this is a bounty for us. This was, for some of our newer, younger dancers, this was the first time that they had been continually employed for, say, 6 months at a time. And that's not at all unusual in the field. So it had a very, very strong meaning to us on an individual level and as artists on a sort of selfish, personal level. And it wasn't until we got to the State Department for our first meeting that we really were able to look outside of that and say, wake up, this actually has much, much greater meaning than even what we're thinking of now. We, were ushered into a small conference room with two people from state who had worked in the region for a long time, and it was all very official and slightly scary. And we had absolutely no idea what they were going to tell us. And they had a lot to tell us about Turkmenistan, particularly what we could not do in Turkmenistan. And so after that talk, I think we were all really like, what are we getting into? This is actually possibly risky. The questions got bigger instead of smaller as we went on. And we got to the part of the conversation about Kyrgyzstan, and the only thing they said was, oh, you're going to love it, it's going to be great. And of course we were primed and we were like, but what about, we can't take pictures of monuments and we can't. They're like, no, it's totally great. You should eat the food is good. They talked for 10 minutes about how good the food was. And we left the meeting thinking we don't know anything about what we're going to do. And we had the presence of mind to ask, what if somebody after the show wants to know what we think about what we're doing here? And the way it was framed to us in that conversation, at least, and that was sort of echoed in the paperwork that they gave us when we left, was that you should avoid those conversations about politics. And I understand this from a larger view. We were there to enact, to answer, and to ask questions about what it is that we do professionally, and we're artists. And none of that was could be off base or could be answered incorrectly. None of our repertory was chosen by anyone but ourselves. We had to make some costume decisions based on the understanding of particularly the female body in the region, and what was sort of acceptable and what would allow people to focus on the dance as opposed to what we were wearing or how we were projecting our own bodies. But other than that, we really were sort of given carte blanche as long as we didn't, look to engage in political discussion. And I think there are a few of the dancers who were sort of like not too into that, and we kept saying like, well, it's not your job, it's not why you're here. And it's interesting because when we got there, it didn't really come up for us, also because it was understood from the other side too that that's why we were there. We were there as artists, and that the entire content of our engagement was as artists. It was accepted that way too.
I find it a really interesting paradox, right? That in some ways the artist is situated as the primary mediator of civil society building, and I think in some ways a democratizing agenda at the same time as a cultural exchange agenda, a way of helping the U.S. to be understood as not simply anti-Islamic or anti-Muslim, but that the artist is also asked not to both be in that position as a political ambassador and not to take any kind of political position. So it's interesting to me. I don't know if you have anything more to say about that, or any other questions you might want to pose to Betsy from your perspective, or vice versa.
I was interested in hearing your response to that as well, because I was sort of wondering if there was more going on that I wasn't aware of. And I have to say that, this is certainly not the core part of U.S. democracy promotion. But I think there has been at least enough wisdom in the State Department, which doesn't always make wise decisions in many respects, but it strikes me that there has been enough sort of sense that we need to be broader than just a pro-democracy agenda. And I think there's been, recognition by U.S. personnel on the ground in Kyrgyzstan over the past 20-some years that to really build relationships with this society, that's absolutely essential, first of all, to build those types of personal relationships. And those relationships have been built through the U.S. State Department there, through the embassy personnel there, through USAID programs there, through civil society organizations, networks there. Much of that is fostered by and financed by the U.S. government in various capacities. But I think there has been sort of a collective wisdom that's developed that those relationships are incredibly important, and that to really broaden and continue those relationships over time, we need to be something beyond just focusing on elections. So it's rewarding to me to see that message has gotten through to the U.S. government, that we can't sort of simply be there saying we're going to finance clean elections and then we're going to leave, because much of U.S. democracy promotion has been about that, and not much else. And that's an extremely short-sighted way, I think, of engaging in that process. What really matters, I think, over the long term, and I think I can say I have something of a long-term perspective on Central Asian society in Kyrgyzstan and elsewhere, I think it's those personal relationships, those personal experiences, sort of witnessing through example, the virtues and values of having an open society and being able to exchange, whether it be on a cultural level or educational or scientific level or some other level. So I'm pleased to see that that's going on.
Do you have any questions for Betsy, coming up from what she's been talking about that you might want to pose?
I was interested in hearing you say more about the absence of the dance tradition that you found in Central Asia, and in learning more from you as to what your Kyrgyz counterparts had to say, or how they explained their own sort of musical experiences and musical traditions, and why what they hope to convey, particularly in these more sort of modern pieces, in their own music.
Yeah, sure. I think and leading into that, it's important to note that even, we didn't have necessarily political conversations on the ground, but art is inherently political. And one thing about one sort of site of productive conflict that we had first going to this region that is, I think, probably directly related to lack of a strong dance tradition in the area is dealing with the body in a way, specifically dealing with the female body, even more specifically displaying, and in a performative sense, the female body. And I think it's probably multifactorial. I don't think it is only related to the sort of Islamic traditions underlying. I think it has a lot, perhaps more to do in Kyrgyzstan with it being, there's very, very strong gender roles. Even in, we think in the US this is something that is not as true in large urban areas. It absolutely was very strongly true in Bishkek where we were, and much more strongly aware of it when we traveled away from Bishkek. But dance puts the body on display, and in a way that it was very, I think, threatening there. And it also requires dance tradition requires people to read the body in a certain kind of way. And if the tradition there was to cover specifically the female body, this was extremely disruptive, what we were doing there. We also, in our work, we have very fluid gender roles in terms of who can do what, who is allowed to dance with whom. Seán always says that his definition of his own contemporary folk dance is who is your folk, who are you allowed to be with, who are you allowed to care for. The idea of partnering has less to do with the man might outweigh the woman and can lift her. We try to partner in ways that does not assume that. And so there are probably a lot of sections of our dances that might have been read through their tradition as being blatantly homosexual, and which would have blown our minds if someone said this, because it was in no way the intention, or that it was just based on this open democratic process of understanding our bodies in a certain way. So that was sort of, when we were teaching dance there to dancers and dance enthusiasts and non-dancers, having them have a sense of their body in a certain way was, I think, difficult and challenging. But music is a really great way of going beyond that. The ensemble that we saw was completely mixed, male, female, and they played quite small instruments. And I think in semi-school traditions, the larger instruments tend to be played by men. This is not true there. It was total equal opportunity for what musical voice they could have. Even in the songs, I think there are some songs that appear to be written from a male perspective that women could sing too. So for us, we understood that better of their work, and it made their work more similar to ours in a way, taking the body out of it.
Have we seen the slides, the images of the dance yet? They're coming up. Okay, so maybe we can look at a few of those images and then open the conversation up to people who are in the audience.
Just a super quick note about the instruments, and I think, Kathleen, what you're mentioning about the pluralist nature of their sort of cultural identity. They're singing, when they sing, they're singing songs, the text is from the late 19th century Russian era. They're playing on instruments that are, a lot of them nascent, like from Iran, 5,000 years old. They're playing folk melodies that are traditional Kyrgyz mountain folk melodies that are probably 3-4 centuries old. And it's all happening and unfolding in linear time. This is all at once, one thing that's happening. And I think that really struck a note with me. Hearing Nerlin speak about the instruments, he's in the middle. Pointy hat. He knows how to make. He sort of maintained the tradition of making, actually physically crafting all of these instruments when it was really under threat from the Soviet regime. He is the historical mind on most of the folk melodies that he has kept alive. Hearing him speak about the traditions of these, it's not just one river. This is a weaving together of millennia of sort of transformations in the area. It's fascinating.
I think that's absolutely correct. I've also heard it described by Kyrgyz as poetically as being a society like an onion. You just keep peeling back layers, and there are more and more interesting layers. When I first arrived, I remember seeing things in multiple different languages and multiple different scripts, and the Persian script and the Latin script and the Cyrillic script, and you have so many different layers of history and culture: the Persian influence, the Arabic influence, the Turkic influence, which has been increasingly strong also in the past 20 years, and certainly a very, very strong Russian influence as well. And the Kyrgyz, I think, are distinct from some of the other peoples of Central Asia in that they've very interestingly incorporated a lot of this, not necessarily seamlessly, but it's not to say that there haven't been conflicts over culture and politics in the past, of course, but that they have really integrated many of these different traditions and ideas artistically as well as in terms of language and culture, other forms of culture.
You want to see a few more?
Sure. That's our tribe. I would note the costumes are designed by Amanda Shaffron, who's a fantastic theatrical designer. We had previously considered ourselves a dance company of lights and tights. And we have a whole lot, many more elements to this. But she's fascinating. She had conceived of this idea of, she was sort of bored by just talking about East meets West. And what is it, she did a ton of research about contemporary clothing layered within and sort of melding with the traditional both patterns and specifically textures. It's an area that's really known for felt and wool production. The costumes are not cool, they're very hot. But I think it's the overall look is, it should be perhaps not seamless. It should be something of a collage. You should see the seams and the transitions between these areas. The backdrop, which is a very, very large print on actually a vinyl of very high resolution photographs of felt rug patterns, traditional in the area. Each one has a specific meaning to the pattern, and they're sort of put together and arranged in this way.
Yeah, many of them actually represent different tribes, or different regions of the country that the different tribes come from.
It's arm and leg.
It's arms and legs, yeah.
Okay. Well, why don't we open up to any comments or questions from people who are in the audience? I know there are a lot of dancers and some speakers up there. Yeah, Susanna.
Well, thank you all for some really interesting stuff. My research has been in the folk tradition, Soviet folk traditions from Stalin era onward. And first I find it really interesting that they were able to get away with not having folk dance in an era when each republic was supposed to have its folk, and I do remember I think it was Dmitry Prokofsky saying, in a certain era, like if you didn't have folk song, well, you were going to get it, So it's really cool that they were able to get away with it.
Yeah, I wonder if, so this came up I've been on tour too long now, I don't remember where I was, but, and it was suggested that, it was John Schaefer, NPR, yeah. He suggested that they just hadn't been maintained, and not that they never existed in the first place. I don't know if he suggested that related to any actual information, but I also would say that we did witness a few male circular structured folk dance, moments of folk dance, and they were, in my limited reading, very related to the Messiah dance tradition, so all male, well, they're not necessarily, but Russian, definitely Russian. And I wonder if it was a situation where they're like, well, we have this, and then we'll sort of like put a Kyrgyz flair on it and call it our own. But looking for really like deeply embedded dance traditions was really, it really didn't lead us anywhere. It's interesting.
And did the musicians talk at all about whether their traditions had been codified in any certain way during the Soviet era, and whether they had made efforts to, I don't know, change them in the subsequent decades?
Yeah, not specifically, but from other related conversations I've had with Nurlenbeck, some of the texts do read as really blatantly Soviet of the songs, and they don't sing the whole time. We only included a couple song pieces. The melodies, I think, were actually, he at least had characterized to me as being under threat, and had sort of escaped to the mountains. He actually, I think, himself escaped to the mountains and had moved away from Bishkek, and then came back in the mid-90s to start his school, to really, like, literally from the ground up, start actually craft the instruments, teach students composition around these types of arrangements. But I did have a conversation with him about the fact that our company found his music quite hard to count. And this is endemic in the dance world, where you say that there's dancer counts and musician counts, and they very often don't line up. But he said, well, it's because it's never been danced to before, and it's not meant to be danced to. Although he said it's not meant to be, but now I think he's started writing us a suite of new music for new dance. So we've convinced him. But it changes meter constantly. And it's incredible. I mean, we are a rhythm group. We're based in very, very strong. Half of our company started in tap and body percussion. And we spent 2 years counting this music and arguing about how to count this music. And so, yeah, it's a piece of the puzzle anyway.
Yeah, I wanted to make a few comments and then ask a couple of questions. So, I just wanted to say that this cultural diplomacy has existed for a long time, and it actually used to be USIA in the embassies throughout the world, and then that, I believe, was dismantled under Bush too. So he, in taking a lot of power from the State Department, basically eliminated the U.S. Information Agency from the embassies. And then I believe under Hillary as Secretary of State, this whole cultural diplomacy came back. So that's a little bit of sort of background on that. And other countries have this. So the British Council, for example, exists in British embassies throughout the world to do the same kind of cultural exchange. And a little bit more about the history, right, in that part of the world is the interwar period, where the Great Game, that was like Central Asia, was all being fought over by France and Britain, not the US, but because of its strategic importance for the Middle East, for oil and everything else. So there's a reason why the US is now focused there, which is, sort of pre-ISIS, but which contributes to that. So there's sort of a great history of sort of cultural exchange, and I guess it changes under different administrations. But getting to the idea of just cultural diplomacy, I'm actually kind of fascinated by the two of you, maybe to comment on sort of cultural diplomacy or exchange as you experienced it, which was more just like discovering a new culture and exchanging and then having this beautiful moment of realizing that the music was going to be the collaborator versus, coming back to where you started, which is cultural diplomacy or cultural exchange with a specific goal of healing conflict or healing trauma. Because there's a lot of that happening now, this idea of cultural exchange in post-conflict or current conflict countries. So I don't even know, maybe how you address that, but maybe if you could even talk a little bit more about your other work, and then maybe we could hear a little bit about the compare and contrast.
Oh, gosh.
Sorry, I know.
Yeah, it's so huge. I'll try to capture a tiny part of it. The first time I went over into Croatia in a refugee camp, it was actually sponsored by IREX, which is Soros Foundation sponsored fund. So it was it's framed as civil society building work, the funding priorities. I spent many years in the Balkans, in Bosnia and Herzegovina mostly, and feeling very complicated about my role there, as a hybrid Croatian-American. Yes, I vaguely speak this language, but so much of the work is being done in English. So many of the NGOs there are English-speaking NGOs. And I felt very complicated about the way that the Balkans were being positioned as a space of both, of kind of this European traumatic space of how could this be happening in Europe, and a kind of way of saying that the Balkans are not Europe as a way of setting up a boundary for what Europe is. Well, Europe is a space of civilization where we don't do this. So Balkans are not Europe, because clearly, and they help us to be European because they set up a boundary space of violent conflict, of intertribal conflict that gets named as non-European. So I've kind of understood, I came to understand a lot of that narrative, and felt that my role as a US artist in that space, a US artist that had links, had ties to the Balkans, was always about trying to complicate the narrative of what was happening and trying to work with youth to create spaces to counter the narratives that were being formulated for them around who they were at that moment. They grew up as Yugoslav, they grew up as non-Muslim, non-Catholic, and they were suddenly being told that they were Muslim, that they were Catholic, that they were served, whatever they were. And the civic space was being structured in a way to emphasize those divisions. And so what we did together was work to create theater that would interrupt those spatial narratives and those civic narratives. And that felt like important work to be doing. It wasn't necessarily US-sponsored work or European-sponsored work. It was a way of crafting spaces for the youth to speak back to their own civically structured narratives of separation through the work that they were doing. They mostly did it through clowning. So I won't go into detail about that. I will say that when I started working with Israeli and Palestinian youth and larger Arab youth, I quickly became convinced that it was much more important for me to be working as someone who amplified and pointed to what was happening in the region than trying to do any kind of work myself. And so that's more of what I've done, is to be an ally to a group. Most of my current work is looking at the work of a group called Combatants for Peace, which is an alliance of Israeli soldiers that refuse to serve in the occupied territory and Palestinians who have used violence as a tactic of resistance and have now understand nonviolence, which you can. There's a lot of discussion about what violence and nonviolence means in that region, but that their work as allies with each other is, I think, doing more interesting things in the region than any outside artist coming in trying to negotiate some sort of conflict transformation through art would do. And that kind of conflict transformation work has a really problematic history in Israel, in that it was used as a way of not talking about the occupation. That kind of person-to-person multi-track diplomacy has its own history of being a way of preventing certain kinds of political analysis. So I hope that starts to address the question you were asking. I don't know how you would respond to that, Betsy.
It related, but perhaps skipping a step, but it's fascinating to me to hear about work that was made on the ground collaboratively, because that's not the way that this work was made. The musicians were in Kyrgyzstan the whole time that we were creating this work, and the dancers were in New York the whole time we were creating this work. And it was also, I mean, this was more of just a primary challenge of could it be done? Could these two, it was sort of a content challenge. How do we bring together the contents of these two folk forms without mimicking each other, without stereotyping, without falling into any kind of appropriation of what we've misunderstood about their culture. And we did an enormous amount of back and forth, but it does make me wonder what would the work look like if we were to go to the area and embed ourselves there and start from scratch on both sides. I think it would be radically different in some ways. I'm convinced we had to start here, I think, from our logistical standpoint, but I think that is very interesting, and I think it's entirely, these sort of relationships and us keeping a relationship through dance motion and having it, we were presented by BAM a few weeks ago, and that was a nice full circle moment. And I should say that we were the first company of dance motion to do that. I'm sure others will happen in the coming years, but it strengthens the possibility that the next level of engagement will happen, where it's not necessarily only hinged on teaching, that actually could create the possibility or the space for this sort of face-to-face creation. Yeah, for sure.
Maybe one or two more questions? Someone looking to you guys for help? Yeah. Jen.
So, Betsy, I'm interested in how you all decided on the content and your discussions about that before you went.
Right. So before we started making this piece.
Well, so the piece came out,
Yeah.
comes out of
Right.
the tour. So how did you decide what your content would be before you went to Central Asia?
So we presented, we were asked to present 3 works, shorter works. Most of our repertoire up until that point had been 20 or 30-minute pieces, so we usually present 3 at a time on a program. We had wanted to present something that was representative of Seán's work. We had an earlier piece from the late 90s, and then 2 more recent pieces. And those were chosen for various sort of logistical and personnel reasons. Who can we bring? We're limited in how many dancers we could bring. Who would they be? How many of them know which repertoire? Who also, if we can't afford to bring understudies, a very practical consideration is what happens if someone gets hurt. We have to bring some people that will know a wide variety of the repertoire. And I think I mentioned earlier that we were not restricted based on content, even though when we got there, and I think we had the suspicion that this might happen, that some of the content was read in ways that we could not control, and that's great, that's fine, and opened up a lot of discussion about what it is that we do and how we create work. So the musicians actually saw us perform before we met them. They came to our concert, and they said very nice things to us about it after. I don't really know exactly how they felt about it, but they told us that they'd never seen anything like it, which I imagine is true. We danced barefoot, which was incensing to a lot of people there. I mean, particularly theater staff were really actually asked us to buy shoes, and we had to explain that this was what we did, and that it is a major part of American modern dance. It's dancing barefoot, and they just found that really off-putting. So I imagine maybe they had a reaction like this, I don't know. And our work is quite athletic, wherein the women are required to do the same physical tasks as the men often. I think that this was also sort of a site of discussion. But that's all they knew about us. And then, we put on our normal people non-spandex clothes and went to the concert and heard them do what they do. And then we went away from them. We moved on in our tour. And we had Skype conversations, and they sent us recordings, and then we sent them video almost weekly, and in the last few months daily. We're sending content back and forth, and we're shaping the content in that way. Not so easy to have a Skype rehearsal when it's like 11-hour time change, 12 hours, yeah. Dancers and musicians of this type tend not to like to work at 3 a.m, so that didn't work out very well. But they were also, because of the necessity of time, and also that there was so much unknown on both sides, particularly from them, about how it is that we create new work. We worked on a base of a repertoire of some arrangements that they'd already recorded, and then those became pulled apart and put back together again based on what we needed. And then the same from us. If we sent them movement material and we said, oh, we took this arrangement of this thing in a 7-meter, but it was so fast that we couldn't physicalize it, so we slowed it down, and Nerlin was like, you can't, that's not acceptable. And you have to set it to something else. And it was like, okay. So we sort of took it apart, chopped some things, but it's now a section in a 6-meter, so it has a sort of weird pulse to it, I think, for that reason. But I am hoping that we will have a project that is new dance to a new score written entirely in time with us creating the piece. Yeah. Yeah.
Any further questions?
was answered.
Last words from Sharon and Jennifer.
Oops, I'll trade it. So, I want to encourage you all again to come to the performance on Saturday night here. Oh, good. She's a whiz with a computer. So it's the Seán Curran Company. I apologize for the sound that you couldn't hear the rehearsal preview, but at any rate, Saturday night here at Northrop, and the pre-show talk at 6:45, and so you'll get to hear talk with Betsy again about how this was created and the issues of meaning. So let's give our panelists a big hand. Thank you.